Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We'll wait a couple more minutes for everybody to join and settle in, but please welcome. Okay, right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our panelists. Well, thanks to Uganda and ActionAid team to make this webinar possible. Nice to see you all. My name is Rebecca Thyssen. I work for CAN International. I'm the global lead on multilateral processes, and I have the pleasure to be moderating this call today. So I suggest we start. I still have some, so to say, boring housekeeping rules to tell you and to give you some context and present everything, and then we can actively get into the topic. So first of all, as you can see, we are in a webinar mode. So this implicates several things. First, if you want, and please, I hope you will, ask some question, please use the Q&A button. You can ask them as we go. We will have a proper and dedicated Q&A moment where I will pick all the questions you may have and direct them to the different panelists. We also ask you, if possible, to indicate who you are, where you come from, what's your organization, and then click on the anonymous button to see also who is in the room and who wants to ask questions. So that's the first thing. Second thing important to know, there is interpretation available in French and Spanish, so please feel free to use it. It would be simultaneous. So that's also a kindly reminder to our panelists to try to speak slowly for the interpreter, as we know it's a very tough job. So we thank all the interpreters to be here today. So that's for the housekeeping rules, and also important to note that this call will be recorded. So if ever, sadly, you have to leave or some colleagues could not attend, we'll be able to share the recording of this call later on. Then let me present you the menu for this afternoon. So first, we will have the pleasure to hear from Farwa Sial and Tim Whyte, who will give an introduction to the latest outcomes from a soon-to-be-published report from ActionAid and Uganda on the opportunities and risk of blending finance. So Tim Whyte is ActionAid Denmark's General Secretary, and Farwa is Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at Uganda. So that would be the first part of our webinar, to really have a good scene setter and understand what we are actually talking about, what are the main risks and opportunities. And then we will have the pleasure to hear 4 amazing speakers in 2 rounds of quick and dynamic questions. So the first round of questions to our panelists would be more trying to understand what is actually blending finance concretely on the ground and how it is assessed to work or not in practice. Then we will have, as I said, a moment of Q&A for you to ask your question and react to what you've been hearing. And secondly, we have a second round to have those opportunities and limits of blending finance situated in the more broader climate finance conversation, particularly, of course, in the context of the upcoming COP28 starting next week. So it's really timely to have that discussion. I'd like also to excuse Bas Eickhout, which is a MEP, Vice President of the Environmental Committee of the European Parliament, who was supposed to join us today, but sadly, because you know politics and last moment issue, he could not make it, but he's in thought with us today and was really interested about the topic. So hopefully we can engage with him later on. So that's it for the introduction and the structure. I also wanted to give maybe some quick context where we stand today and why we are organizing this webinar. I'll be very short because we want to hear from our panelists, but I believe, as you know, the climate finance is a very boiling issue. COP28 is around the corner, so maybe it's interesting to have some perspective. So as you know, climate crisis is worsening. We see some worrying records every week. New records are really clear about it. And so are the financing needs increasing as well, particularly for a developing country. So the urgency and scale of the climate crisis have led the financial agenda to be more and more focused on mobilizing private finance for climate, seen, at least for developed countries, to be the preferred solution for raising funds at the scale of the need. So maybe one good scene setter, you may have seen that the OECD recently published the last 2021 numbers. So as you know, we always have 2 years to look back in the past to see where we at. So that's the most recent numbers. We don't have yet the one of 2022, but it's interesting also to know where we stand, at least today, with the latest data. So as I said, we're still missing the 2022 numbers, so it's hard to make assumption of where we are at exactly towards the 100 billion goal. But what we can see is positively 7.6% increase in 2021. So if we continue on that trend, it would mean that in 2022 we are almost, but not yet, reaching the 100 billion goal. So that would be also fitting into the conversation at COP28. Well, right, whether developed countries will or not be able to claim at some point that they're meeting their obligation, that they're delivering on their broken promises. As a reminder, also, it's important to remember that the commitment that was taken in Copenhagen and in the Paris Agreement is to meet the 100 billion goal every year after 2020, right? So it's 100 billion at least minimum every year between 2020 and 2025. So it means that in any case, developed countries have a delay in fulfilling that obligation, because we know that 2020 and 2021, that 100 billion goal was not met. So it's important also to frame that quantitative wise, that we are far from being yet there, whatever the reports and the media can interpret on those new numbers. On the quality of finance, and we are talking a lot about private finance, so it's interesting to see that there was a small increase of private finance, but overall it remains quite stagnating, at least since 2017, despite the significant growth in public finance. So that's also interesting to see that we are seeing private finance as a silver bullet in a lot of different political statements and commitments, but when we look at the numbers, we quite see it a stagnation rather than a real increase. So that's also an interesting perspective, I believe, to integrate in the conversation today. And also important trend to note that's actually quite worrying is the decrease of adaptation finance. While a lot of reports, and you can just take the adaptation gap report from the UNEP last week, are very clear of the need of adaptation finance for a developing country as being a priority. Also, developed countries have committed in Glasgow COP26 to double adaptation finance by 2025 compared to 2019 level. So how are we going to reach those commitments and deliver again on those promises? That's, I guess, something important to question here. And moreover, we won't have the space to discuss that today, but you know that finance is much more than just climate finance, right? It's happening in every room, in every negotiating streams, from the GST to the loss and damage fund to the adaptation goal, and so on and so forth. So important to situate that conversation in the wider landscape of climate action, because finance is really the lever to deliver on the different objectives of the Paris Agreement. Also, in that context, the European Union is positioning itself as a climate finance leader, which it is. It's the biggest climate finance provider, championing in a way public finance. Again, in its last COP28 position, it's very clear in the context of the NCQG, so the future climate goal. But it's as well, as we will hear, advocating strongly for blending finance and the private sector within the climate finance spectrum. So how to manage this, how to make this compatible is a question that we will also willing to hear from our panelists. So that was a bit of a concrete, I think, and a scene setter for you to have some perspective of where we stand today. So now we will narrow the scope a bit and focus specifically on the instrument of blending finance. Is it working? Is it reaching those who need it the most? What are the main recommendations? What are the main limits? That will be our conversation. So without further ado, as announced, I will give the floor to Tim Whyte first to give ActionAid Denmark's perspective on what is blending finance and what are its main assumptions about it, and then giving the floor to Farwa for also an introductory presentation. Tim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for joining us. We are a little overwhelmed by the interest in the topic, but great to have so many people online for this. Maybe just to start a little bit with ActionAid's interest in this. I mean, we at ActionAid Denmark have been working on defunding fossil fuels for some time now. And we've had quite a bit of success. We focus especially on Danish banks, but increasingly also on Nordic financial institutions, pension funds, the Norwegian Oil Fund. And all of this is really part of a larger push to turn the flows of finance from funding what we know is causing the climate crisis towards alternative sources. And this year, we actually started a Nordic Center on Sustainable Climate Finance to lead this work. One of the challenges that we have seen is, in some ways, it's easier for us as an NGO to work in the area of defunding climate, fossil fuel companies than it is on finding, what should we say, the ideal or the at least the workable, sustainable investments that we encourage banks, pension funds, and other institutions to invest their money in the global south. And I think, to be honest, I think it's hard because it is hard. I mean, if you look at a lot of the investments that we have seen historically in the global south, there have been many issues in terms of, basic issues around human rights, around taxation, around profit sharing, around whether or not these investments genuinely create jobs. But it's also true increasingly that we can see that, we know that there will be increasing investments and increasing blended finance in some of these areas. And so we've really tried to sort of get ahead of this issue and to try to begin to identify, well, what are the conditions where we believe that blended finance can be useful or private investments are needed. This isn't to say that we don't recognize all of the challenges that we are facing in this area, but that we also feel an obligation, given that we see increasingly billions being invested towards this, and we predict that more and more money will be invested towards this, to also begin to have a conversation among stakeholders, among, where we see opportunities and what conditions would be needed for this investment to actually be sort of a meaningful investment, not just in the climate transition, but in creating jobs, supporting local communities in addressing their energy needs, and so forth. And so because of this, I'm very happy to be having this conversation today with all of you around the risks and opportunities that we see within blended finance. We've tried to put together a diverse panel which represents different stakeholder groups and viewpoints, and I hope that this can be the beginning or maybe part of an ongoing dialogue about how we ensure a Southern-led just transition and ensure that that transition gets the support and financing it needs, whether that's through blended finance or through other means. And so in closing, I guess I would just say that what I hope for this conversation is not so much a discussion about whether or not we need blended finance, because we know blended finance is going to happen, but more a question of where and how we think it can be useful. In other words, what are the places where we see under these conditions and in this area, we think that this might actually be useful? Not least because that clarifies in what areas we don't believe it's useful, where we believe public financing is needed and will continue to be used. So that we can begin to have a more nuanced conversation about the incredible financing needs that there are to manage a just transition. So I look very much forward to hearing the discussions and the insights, not just today, but also in the future.
Thank you, Tim, for this first introduction. Farwa, I'll let you continue. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Farwa. I work at Eurodat as a Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer. I'm just going to start by sharing some slides. So if we can have the slides, Stephanie, please. Okay, thanks a lot. So as has already been mentioned, today's webinar is a precursor to the launch of a joint report by ActionAid and Eurodat on blended finance and climate action. And we hope to launch this report in December. The purpose of the report is to raise awareness on the subject of what blending in climate action broadly looks like, and to have a critical approach to the blended finance agenda from a public interest point of view and a civil society perspective. This is quite important because even though, sorry, this is the first, if you just go back, please, thanks. So this is quite important because even though blended finance has been there for some time, reports by civil society activists and academic papers are actually quite limited. So maybe if you count them, they're probably under 20 or even under 15. And here, of course, I'm speaking of blended finance in development projects in general and not blending in climate. So in this context, an additional aim of the report and this webinar is to create dialogue among different stakeholders in blended finance and to better integrate the constructs of what is commonly referred to as the development finance community and the climate finance community, with the view to creating more synergies and better understanding of what's happening and where we are. So I'm just going to speak for 10 minutes. And this presentation will be quite basic, and it is meant as an introduction to this webinar, covering some broad themes in the report. And I will have around 5 slides. I will start with an introduction, overview of key trends of blended finance and climate action. Then I will move on to 7 risks, 5 opportunities, and 5 policy recommendations. So really quite targeted, and I hope I make it in time. The next slide, please. So let's start with what blended finance is. And this is a very, very basic definition, but I think it's quite comprehensive since it covers all aspects, which is that blended finance can be broadly defined as the combination of public concessional official development assistance with private or public resources, generally with the aim of mobilizing or leveraging development finance from other actors. So blended is one key private finance instrument, which is part of what is commonly referred to as a de-risking agenda, in which the risks of the private sector are mitigated through subsidies to then attract private finance for different developmental and climate action projects. And there's an image on the right, which is very basic and quite simple, and you see it almost now everywhere because it's so easy to understand. If you think about the background to blended finance, it lies in 2 major proposals by the World Bank, of which we are very aware of by now in the development finance jargon at least. And these are 2 reports, one in 2015 and the other in 2017, called Billions to Trillions and Maximizing Finance for Development. And these were launched in the post-2008 financial global crisis. And the basic aim of these reports was to promote a series of instruments to accelerate the flow of private finance through public subsidies and innovations in de-risking strategies. So they were called a paradigm shift in how development finance was being mobilized and implemented. Having said all of this, one of the major problems with blended finance at the moment is that there isn't an agreed official shared definition. So in the report, for example, we compared the definitions of blended finance by just 3 organizations: the International Energy Agency, OECD, and the European Commission, and each definition varies. A lack of a harmonized definition, of course, has an impact on reporting, evaluation, and ultimately measuring the actual impact or additionality of using private finance, which is being mobilized through blending. If we consider that the main goal of blending is to crowd in or leverage private finance, but there is no consistency in how institutional reports measure the amount of private finance being mobilized. At the same time, leverage ratios continue to vary according to donor and investor approach, which makes this entire concept quite elusive, and actually even for civil society to understand or academia to measure what is being reported as additional finance is quite hard. Having said that, in 2021, the OECD Development Assistance Committee, or DAC, approved the OECD UNDP impact standards for financing sustainable development, which are attempts at harmonizing best practices used by different development financial institutions. But we have to remember that at the moment, these are still voluntary approaches subject to self-assessment and reporting, so they hold no obligations on different DFIs. Next slide, please. So the report is actually focusing on climate action specifically, and we use the term keeping in mind that climate finance has a very specific context, and what we were trying to do is to cover a broad range of climate-related investments beyond specific official and unofficial taxonomies. And as you know, as Rebecca has already mentioned, blended finance and climate have picked up pace in recent years, responding to the climate emergency as well as the climate pledges made by developed countries, and it's rooted in this idea of a financing gap, which lays a lot of emphasis to the quantity of finance which is needed for blended finance. But a case that we make in the report is that the quantity has to match the quality of the kind of finance that is being provided. So we have 6 trends here. If we start with the amount of blended finance which is being mobilized, between 2019 and 2021, 14 billion was invested into blended climate finance transactions. And this is in comparison to 36.5 billion between 2016 and 2018. So this decline is owing to a combination of reasons, including a fall in demand during the COVID pandemic, and risk aversion by investors. But we would actually like to hear more from some of our panelists on this as well. If we consider the stakeholders, blended finance projects are delivered through the collaboration of a diverse set of actors, which include multilaterals, bilaterals, donors, as well as private investors and private actors such as philanthropic organizations, companies, commercial banks, insurance companies are all active participants in the blended finance landscape. If we consider the type of climate finance, there is an overwhelming inclination towards mitigation. According to Convergence, a think tank which is focusing on blended finance specifically, between 2019 and 2021, 58% of commitments of blended finance were directed towards mitigation. In terms of the type of blended finance instruments, there is an inclination towards concessional senior loans. And this is debt that takes priority over other unsecured or otherwise more junior debt. This is followed by risk-sharing facilities, guarantees, junior debt, and performance grants. The recipients are of specific category here because the largest recipient of blended finance for climate have been corporates, project developers, with 70% going in 2016 to 2018, and this has actually risen to 78% in 2019 to 2021. In terms of regional distribution, over the period of 2016 to 2021, the majority of blended finance investments were to Africa, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean. And the largest transactions were actually targeted towards middle-income countries. This was followed by lower middle-income countries, but low-income and LDC or least developing countries continued to lag behind. So this is also a trend which is consistent in development finance, which means that the least developing countries are really behind in this agenda. The next slide, please. So when we consider blended finance for public interest, or how it's actually playing out on the ground, something that is very, very important from this perspective is the key risks of this entire blended finance agenda. And we listed 7 risks, and of course they're interchangeable, and there are attempts to highlight certain things in certain ways. And the first one we identified is the role of blended finance in the risk of perpetuating climate coloniality. So blended finance projects, in essence, are ultimately a subsidy to global north investors, whether they are in renewable energy or development or green energy. So there is a risk here that blended finance projects perpetuate neo-colonial extraction of natural resources, and major examples which have been extensively covered by CSOs are in the export of hydrogen, for example. At the same time, critical raw materials are another agenda which have been very extractive in nature. And here, this is also important to note that instruments, private finance instruments or blended finance cannot be analyzed in isolation from the ongoing relations and context in which developing countries find themselves in. So when we identify or isolate an instrument, we have to relate it to other aspects of trade, other aspects of financial flows, and then understand the total impact of what's happening in these countries. A second aspect related to this is the role of blended finance in contributing towards marketization of the climate agenda in Global South. So the model of blending, which is being provided, is provided in context to public-private partnerships, PPPs, accompanied by liberalization conditionalities at times, as well as legal restructuring to accommodate investor needs, all of which transforms citizens in developing countries into consumers. So this is a major risk. A third risk is how blended finance can contribute towards recipient country indebtedness. So blended finance entails debt, which needs to be repaid, even if the beneficiaries are provided with softer terms than purely commercial loans. And this needs to be better analyzed, better quantified, but it can certainly lead to countries' indebtedness, especially at this time now, where over 50 countries in the developing world are actually struggling with their debt. A fourth point is the reliance of blended finance on external private finance, which leads to the risk of crowding out domestic financial sector in host countries. So projects which are not aimed at supporting, targeting, or developing domestic private sector do not focus on fostering economic linkages with the rest of the economy. And these linkages are very necessary for strengthening, deepening, and expanding domestic financial markets. And so an ad hoc approach to climate transition based on external financing actually isolates these links. If you look at developed countries or even countries which developed late, it's quite important to know that they had a very strong public finance model, as we see in the case of East Asian development model. A fifth risk is that blended finance undermines a country's ability to have country ownership over its investment in vital climate technologies by prioritizing the interest of foreign private investors. So under the UNFCCC convention text, countries in the global north bear the responsibility for transferring relevant climate technologies to the global south. And similarly, under the Rio Declaration, newly developed technologies are supposed to be in the public domain and made accessible to developing countries at affordable prices. However, at the moment, this is not the case. So royalties on climate technologies, for example, are really a big burden on developing countries. A sixth risk, which has been extensively reported, is blended finance projects suffer from low transparency and poor democratic accountability. And there are numerous examples which have been reported in the news as well as documented by CSOs. And this pattern can also be repeated in climate projects once again. Finally, there is the fact that blended finance has not been successful in mobilizing adequate amounts of private finance for climate action. In 2021, development finance institutions financed long-term projects with a total volume of 13.4 billion, in which the total volume of private sector finance leverage was approximately 4.6 billion. So it's not actually meeting the targets that it was supposed to meet, which was the very aim of mobilization. Next slide, please. So looking at these risks, we also thought of what could be the opportunities in overcoming further escalation of debt and so on. And we identified 5 opportunities. Our first one in which Eurodad has actually worked a lot is on public banks. So the redirection of external concessional finance to strengthen public finance for climate action in recipient countries, we think could have a positive impact on projects. And we know that regional and national public development banks, if well governed and resourced, especially in the COVID pandemic, as we see, can play a critical role in supporting climate resilient infrastructure and public services. A second opportunity is the OECD UNDP impact standards for financing sustainable development. So as already mentioned, they're quite comprehensive. They are potential avenues for improving transparency, and they promote best practice. However, they are voluntary, and we think that they could be, if they are legally binding, they could build standards in which blended finance can operate well. The third element is grants-based blended finance, which supports local private sector companies, entrepreneurs, and communities. So by strengthening the domestic private sector, the role of blended finance can improve vastly. A fourth element is grant-based blended climate finance to increase investment in renewable energy infrastructure. So once again, empowering the domestic private sector to invest in manufacturing climate-related technologies and know-how can empower developing countries a lot more. Finally, a fifth element is again grant-based blended finance, because ultimately we are talking about the responsibility of global North countries to global South. And if the nature of climate finance, as it should be, moves towards grants, there is a bigger chance that blended finance could operate better. The last slide, please. So we have 5 policy recommendations on this report. The first is to improve the additionality of blended finance. So this has to be measured, this has to be evidenced, and it should be such that it is based on attracting both investments that would not have happened otherwise, so financial additionality, as well as development additionality, which is to say that the involvement of private sector has built these strong linkages in recipient countries to then ease their transition towards cleaner technologies. A second point is to ensure that all blended finance projects are transparent, include key information, especially on subsidies to different actors, disclosures on intermediaries, and democratic accountability of equal partnership. A third point is, and we stress this quite a lot, which is that blended finance must not be used as a financing instrument for the loss and damage fund, simply because this fund is based on the responsibility of global North countries to global South. A fourth point is that blended finance for climate action should not be subject to economic policy conditionalities and should not force countries to undergo restructuring of legal processes to adjust to investor needs. In particular, this also includes avoiding policy conditionalities that promote the privatization of public infrastructure and services or deregulation. Finally, country ownership and community-led solutions are very important, and they should be at the forefront of building resilience and adaptation to climate change. And blended finance practitioners should explore best practices and possible approaches in this area. So ultimately, what we're saying in the report is that for blended finance to be an effective tool for climate action, its efficacy, additionality, transparency must be adequately established. At the moment, we're not there yet, and there's a long way to go. So I'll stop here and move to other panelists. Thanks, Laure.
Thank you very much, Farah, and also Tim, for your intervention. I think it's helpful for everyone here in the room to understand where we stand, what is blending finance, what are the main recommendations we could have towards this instrument. So now I will start with our first round of intervention. I will ask the panelists to try to stick around the 5 minutes that were assigned to make sure that we have interactive discussion afterwards. Please feel free to react to what you just heard and also to react to what each other are saying during each interventions. So I will start with you, Sarah. You are a climate policy expert at ActionAid Uganda. I will let you present yourself briefly as well during your intervention. So the question I had for you is, as you are leading programs on identifying and supporting community-led solution to climate change in Uganda, can you tell us a bit more about this project and the kind of finance and other supports that you have been benefiting from? And maybe what are the barriers you identify to an increased provision of climate finance and other supports at the project level? So a very local perspective, I believe, and will benefit from your expertise. Thank you, Sarah. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. I will share my screen briefly to so hopefully you are able to see the screen. Yes, Rebecca?
Yeah, we do. I was just confirming.
Okay, great.
It's in slide mode.
Quickly, this work is being implemented under the Global Program on Climate Justice, which has also a track on alternatives. And among there are 9 countries that are participating, and so far these are Bangladesh, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Liberia, Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, and Bangladesh. A number of
Sarah, sorry to interrupt. Can you put your slides in slide mode so that we can see them well? Because now we're just seeing part of it. Sorry for that, but just to be sure that we can benefit from. Yes, perfect. Thanks. Sorry.
Okay, great. So at the moment, 9 countries are participating in the collection of these cases that are community-led, specifically women and youth-led climate solutions that we are calling alternatives. And a few countries have already completed the collection of these cases. However, others are still going on in the process. I'll just share a little bit of the preliminary results that we are seeing at the moment, just to show the variety of these cases. A number of them, they focus sectors, energy and agriculture, and the different community-led solutions that we're seeing around biogas production, cook stoves, improved cook stoves, that is both for household use but also for institutional utilization. We are also seeing biofertilizer production and manufacturing, and also to mention that these solutions are at different levels of the growth curve. Some are just started, others are already on the market, so they face various challenges. And then we are also seeing those that are addressing water challenges through kits where water filter kits where there's no need for boiling the water. so that households can be able to access drinking water, not only households, but also health facilities and centers. Then we are also seeing also those that are generating biobriquettes that are looked at in terms of green energy. And also in Bangladesh, we also have seen that some of the communities are undertaking per day or rice growing at the coastal zones in a climate resilient manner, and undertaking various climate resilient practices and technologies within this. In Nigeria, we are also seeing a little bit more at a higher scale in terms of solar production, solar for productive use, where small businesses are using various business models to be able to provide electricity for productive use. For instance, what they are talking about as payment in installments. So those are just to highlight a little bit of a few of the community-led climate solutions we are seeing within the agriculture and energy spaces. Just to quickly mention that as the program, we are developing an alternatives database where select sample of these cases will be included. And once it is completed, it can be easily accessible at the ActionAid Denmark website. So this would be generally a tool for advocacy, but also for linking potential funders with these community-led alternatives. So for the first start as a pilot, we anticipate to have 30 to 40 alternative cases or climate solutions, which will be included within this database. As mentioned, these solutions, climate solutions, at different stages of growth curve. And as of now, what we've seen in terms of financial instruments accessed, we have seen majorly it is grants through various institutions, but also sponsorship, specifically through corporate social responsibility for various, whether they are banking or telecommunication companies. And the major non-financial instrument that has been obtained is capacity building and technical assistance through either government, but also NGOs like ourselves, ActionAid, but also others. So far, that is what we are seeing from the cases that have been collected at this level. And then in terms of the needs in financial and non-financial support that these sustainable solutions that are community-led need, majorly in terms of grants. And these grants, the solutions are mentioning that they need one for infrastructure development, either fabrication of the required tools, or enhancing what they have at the moment, whether it is kilns, whether it is molding machines for briquettes, but also issues to do with market development and also capacity development again. And for those that are at a higher level, we're seeing that they are also requiring innovative financing instruments like the lease to own, which would support to address the issues of collateral requirements that most of the either microfinance institutions or commercial institutions would be asking for. So this kind of asset finance and the other innovative instruments, if blended together with the grants and capacity building and technical assistance, would be able to support them to scale up and scale deep, and also be replicated in other regions where they are not. So again, just to re-emphasize that blending of both the loans for those that are at a level where they are accessing loans, but also grants, which deals more on issues to do with bookkeeping, group dynamics, governance, and management issues. Then others we're also looking at, especially those that are within the agriculture sector, that they need some guarantees, especially those that have accessed loans, so that they can be cushioned in the events that they are having the extreme challenges of climate change where it affects their production, and also integration of of insurance instruments such as the weather index. So a few of those that we've looked at that have been collected have accessed some of these, but others are also struggling. And I'm mentioning that if, for instance, it is easier to access data around the work that they are implementing or the different climate resilient technologies and practices they are implementing without the banks coming physically into their groups, then they would be able to have ease and reduced administrative and monitoring costs on the bank side, and thus reducing the interest rates that they are incurring. The other need that was also mentioned was the fact that at the moment, some of the financing available, because it is coming through development partners and also accessed internationally, usually it comes in foreign currency and it becomes very expensive. So if they are financing in the local currency, then it would make it very affordable for these community-led initiatives that have reached a scale where they are able to get financing from either cooperatives, VSLs, also commercial banks. And then also what has also come through in some of the recommendations from these cases of the issues that they are facing is that, yes, a number of funds that have been that are in the region are also looking at regional level without really focusing at the country context level. So there's need for scaling down. That otherwise makes some of the countries not easily able to access some of this financing to scale up or even replicate some of these climate solutions. And lastly, the cases, the implementers of some of these cases are also indicating that there's a need for a dedicated climate finance mechanisms at these countries that would support community efforts to invest and adopt the better sustainable alternatives. Just to briefly touch on again, some of these I've already mentioned them, but the non-financial support that is required and needs to be blended with the financial instruments is capacity building. I've already mentioned that. The cases have also mentioned that they need support in developing of their value chain, as mentioned that some of these are at different stages of growth. There are those that have just started and they need to be replicated, and yet the need for their products, whether it is cookstoves, whether it is water filters, whether it is the products in terms of agriculture that are produced, the demand is quite a lot, but they have a little bit of a capacity gap in development of the value chain. And then also we see that
I'm sorry, I will have to ask you to wrap up if possible, because we have other opportunity to engage on this topic. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Then also just to lastly mention that a lot of request on support to create behavior change, awareness creation, and business development services in issues to do with bookkeeping, standardization of forms that are needed, and also the establishment of knowledge sharing platforms as some of those needs that the sustainable climate solutions in these various countries are already mentioning. So thank you so much. Probably more information will be shared as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and sorry to have the bad cop role of being strict on the timing, but just to make sure we have interaction, and I'm sure you can share more during the Q&A and the second round of intervention. So thank you so much for that. I think it's a great start for our first round of intervention. So without further ado, I will turn up to you, Amar Inamdar, who is Managing Director of KawiSafiVentures. So my question for you, Amar, is as you are an impact investor, you've been channeling fundings from investors and donors to project entrepreneurs in the Global South. So can you tell us more about your work and the kind of challenge you've been facing? What are the things you'd like to see more from donors and the DFIs? And if you can also quickly introduce yourself, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Am I now hearable, I hope? I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. And Sarah, thanks a lot. And Farah, thanks very, very much for your comments as well as we lead into this and have a thoughtful conversation about the role of blended finance, right? I mean, I think that's the key here. I'm Amar Inamdar. I run a financial intermediary. So we're a fund manager based out of East Africa. So I'm based out of Nairobi. We have a small team there. And in the impact space, what we're doing is we're primarily looking at identifying companies that will deliver products and services that meet the essential needs, the essential everyday needs of people everywhere. So things like affordable energy, things like solar irrigation pumps, things like two-wheeler transportation that allows people and products to get from place to place. Essential ordinary needs desperately lacking and desperately lacking in capital for folks to be able to access those things on a basic everyday basis in many of the markets. So we target underserved markets. We target consumers that typically aren't getting access to the things that I think many of us in this room probably take for granted. And why aren't they getting those things? Well, because companies who might be able to afford products and services don't reach those markets and find it very, very difficult to raise capital to do the kinds of things that Sarah was talking about, right, in the last positioning. So how do we help those sorts of companies? How do we help companies to get that capital and put that capital to work in these markets? And I just want to convey a really strongly increasing sense of frustration at the conversations happening at the global level, at the COPs, in the finance community, at GFANs, with the trillions of dollars being allocated to climate finance. Very little of that ever seems to make it to getting a light bulb in someone's house, getting connectivity, getting mobility, getting clean water, getting irrigation products that improve on-farm productivity. These are critical things that are essential to allow people to participate in an economy and to grow and to be part of what we all want to see in the climate context, which is a resilient, adaptive, and low carbon growth, where the path to, if not prosperity, at least a sense of inclusive well-being, economic inclusive well-being, is something that can be respected and managed. So as an impact investor, what we're looking for is how do we allocate, how do we select those companies that deliver that set of products and services, be it mobility or agricultural refrigeration or residential energy? How do we screen those companies, and then how do we allocate capital to them? There is very little capital going to those companies. So just to contextualize this, when we look at the climate debate writ large, and you look at what is Africa, based on the national action plans, based on the government's contributions to the COP processes, $250 billion a year to meet climate ambition, resilience, adaptation, and mitigation. $250 billion a year. Let's just ground ourselves in reality. 3% of global financing makes it into Africa. 3% of global financing. It's a horribly similar number to the 3% of the contribution that Africa has, as a continent, has made to cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. There is too little capital entering these markets because investors are not going there. Why are they not going there? So the key thing where we would stand is target these markets, reflect on it. I appreciated many of your conclusions in terms of asking for greater transparency, looking for where that leverage is, being accountable to outcomes. There is a set of investments here that we can make that meet many of those criteria, and we're not getting enough capital. We feel that blended financing is one of several planks. Right? The whole world needs to act in concert to address the biggest challenge of our times, where none of us is going to be able to do it alone. Public governments, public budgets are heavily indebted after COVID. So blending is one way, one of several ways of supporting the path toward a climate transition, so long as those investments are targeted, and so long as we're clear about what we're trying to do and how we're going to measure the outcomes. What we've seen is that investors are very flighty. Post-COVID, you've seen macroeconomics change, you've seen an energy crisis, you've seen wars in the Ukraine and the Middle East. You've seen basically a halving of the private capital that would go into early stage investments of the kinds that we would look at. And we see blending as an opportunity to create a catalytic effect to bring investors back into the market and support the kinds of outcomes for consumers that ultimately we need to see. Better transportation means you can get your products to market. You can have more resilience in getting greater income. You can employ more people. You can employ more women, and women can get cook stoves. So there's a gender component here to ensure that the 1.2 billion people who currently live and work on biomass cook stoves get access to cleaner cooking. So there's a set of products and services here that I think are crying out for an alternative form of financing where blending can reduce the cost of capital to the consumer. You know, one of the biggest dilemmas I think we all face in emerging markets is sort of in the financial system writ large, the way we've designed it. Money is cheap to those that already have it. It's very expensive to those that don't. It's unbelievably expensive to those that don't, because they're perceived to be risky, they're perceived to have low purchasing powers, they can't participate in markets in the way that financiers want them to participate, to lower the risk of the financier. And blending is one way to start to crack open that vicious cycle and try to make it possible for more capital to come into these markets, to readjust the risk-return equation that allows for some of the success stories to start to come out that will then shift the trend toward better financing, better outcomes, and better products and services for people on the ground. So look, this is a really crucial area. I'm just kind of wrap up here. It's a really crucial area. We could talk about it for a very long time. There's a very pragmatic piece here, which is the financial system needs to adjust to the realities of climate change. This is the biggest systemic change that humanity has ever attempted to undertake, and we need to succeed at it. In the here and now, blending is one of the key instruments, alongside carbon taxation, alongside carbon markets, alongside all sorts of different instruments that we could deploy. But it's one instrument that I think we can deploy that could make a transformative difference if done right in the markets that deserve it the most. And our fear is that we just don't get anywhere near the level of capital that consumers and people, let's not call them consumers, ordinary people in emerging markets deserve. So let me just pause there and pass it on.
Great. Sticking to the timing, Amar. Thank you. Thank you very much. Building up on the two first intervention, I will now turn to Laure Blanchard-Brunac, who is Director of Policy and Partnership at EDFI and InvestEU Investment Committee member as well. So question for you, Laure. As a DFI, you've been championing the blended finance agenda as you see it crucial to the scale up of overall climate finance provision. And as I was explaining, and as we heard from different panelists, this is a critical issue. So can you tell us to what extent blending has enabled you to increase climate finance provision and climate impact? And also, if you could elaborate specifically a bit more on the way you assess those impacts of those interventions, that would be really interesting. Thank you. You have approximately 5 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca, and thanks for organizing this webinar. Blended finance is obviously a crucial topic for us at EDFI. I will share a bit of elements from the experience of our members. So we are not a DFI ourselves. We are the association representing European development finance institutions. There are 15 of them in Europe today. And sorry, the slides don't move. So sorry about that. I think it's stuck and I'm
gonna... do you want to try to reload them again?
Let me try that.
Sometimes the basics works. No, we can try.
Okay, it seems
Right.
better now. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so we have 15 members. They're DFI, they are development finance institution, they are state-owned organization that invest in developing countries only, and only in the private sector transactions. So they are mostly from Western Europe. And I would like to recall that back in 2020, our members collectively took a commitment to abide by some principles on climate and energy finance, one of which is the end of support to fossil fuel projects. And another set of commitments are quite important for banks, such as aligning with climate risk assessment, aligning with Paris alignment and agreement, and enforcing TCFD. Now, we have, when you look at the activity of the DFIs, that's roughly 50 billion euro of portfolio today. And that represents outstanding investments, about a bit more than 6,000 outstanding investments. So on these investments, we track impact. Here you have a collection of the key impact indicators that were collected over 5 years, the jobs supported by EDFI investments, the energy produced in terawatt, and actually the number back in 2022 got even higher. I think it was 173 instead of 101. So these are increasing over time with the increase of the portfolio amount overall. Also, we track how much tax is paid by EDFI businesses. So this is the impact indicator you see here in terms of domestic resource mobilization, how much DFIs invest in fragile states. And among all these impact indicators, we also calculate how much concessional finance they use. So, and to give you an idea of the scale of this impact, in 2022, the most recent numbers that you don't see on these slides, but which I can share, there's been a reduction of 15 million tons of CO2 on the EDFI portfolio, which is like a reduction of GHG emissions. And that is equivalent to the annual emissions of Kenya, or equivalent to 15% of Belgium's annual emissions. When we talk of the taxes paid by EDFI finance businesses in 2022, this is amounting to 20.8 billion. That's the equivalent to the public revenues of Nigeria. And I think to relate to what Amar mentioned earlier, which is very relevant to the debate, it's the fact that basically the DFIs as key finance institutions for the Global South, they are connecting developing countries to the broader financial market. That's very much what their role is about, hence the scale of the investment. Now, when we dive a bit more into blended finance more specifically, so in our group, and I think it was very right to mention the issue with the definitions. That's actually quite an issue in our group. When we talk of blended finance, we really talk of blended concessional finance. So for DFIs using concessional finance to mobilize private investment. Well, the first thing is that for us, it makes sense to deploy blended finance in a broader context where the objective is really to mobilize private finance. And that goes through different measures. So blended finance is basically the set of financing measures, the financing solutions, but it goes hand in hand, or at least it should in principle go hand in hand with some regulatory measures. So what we see, for example, recently in terms of the emergence of the taxonomies, the EU one, but not only. Today there are about 30 taxonomies across the world. Or the governance discussion, for example, on the reform of MDB agenda and by the same occasion DFI reforms. These are measures that for us all go hand in hand in terms of the same objective of mobilizing private finance. And as it was recalled earlier, that scale-up of blended finance becomes an imperative when it comes to climate finance to de-risk investors when it comes to the type of risk you find in developing countries, but also to de-risk investors on the climate and the clean tech innovation that are required to go to address climate change today. I'm just going quickly through that, but I thought that was interesting also to address your point on the drop in 2019-21 of blended finance. I think this period for the DFIs and for MDBs equally has been really marked by COVID. There's been a massive amount of finance that was allocated to blended finance that was reoriented for COVID response, basically. And also another thing which I think is interesting there is that there's been a few of the major blended finance initiatives that have been launched just right before 2019 in 2018. So you have the IDA private sector window for IFC. I put here the EGO fund from Amundi, which is just an example of a private-led blended finance initiative. But also on the EU side, there was a launch of the European Fund for Sustainable Development that was launched in 2017 and then started being rolled out in 2018. And these blended finance initiatives, as big as they are, they unfortunately take a lot of time to be deployed. And this is where basically there's a bit of a gap between what you hear as announcement and what effectively happens on the ground. And actually, I think that's the speed of delivery of blended finance is one of the issues we face in our community. I would like to share a few examples of what European DFIs have set up in terms of dedicated vehicles to mobilize private finance for developing countries and especially for climate. There is a Danish SDG investment fund where basically IFU, the Danish DFI, our member, took advantage of the fact that they are in a market where pension funds are quite active. So for those who are not aware, in Europe, leaving aside the UK, but in the EU, the Denmark and the Netherlands are where the pension funds are really the largest. So IFU took advantage of that, created a partnership with the Danish government and Danish pension funds, and they created a fund for impact in Africa, which started showing results. And you can see here, I put the link to the impact report, in fact, for this fund, which was published recently. It's a lot to do with inclusive finance, access to finance for SMEs and renewable energy. FinFund at a smaller scale has done the same in Finland with Finnish investors, more private investors than institutional investors, but a similar logic. And another nice example is what Cofides has done with the Uruma Fund, where this time they partnered with the Spanish government, but also with the EU to have a first loss mobilizing investment from Spanish banks, basically. And the vehicle was dedicating finance to smallholder farmers in Africa. So in terms of the activity, it's been growing. We could have shown a better, more striking chart than this one. Sorry about that. But basically, there's been really an evolution, and the numbers are oscillating between 2016 2018. There was about 0.3, 0.4 stagnating use of blended finance every year. And when I say blended finance here, it's really concessional finance. And we saw this increasing to roughly 1 billion in 2022. It's to leverage about 3 billion euro of investment. And you can see that the major part of this blended finance has been used for projects in Africa and for climate. So really looking at the most difficult segment for DFIs to address. And this money is coming mostly from the DFI shareholders for now, although the EU is increasingly a bigger donor of the DFIs, and I will come back on that. And the 2% you see here from others is basically the Green Climate Fund that the DFIs are accessing more and more. On the EU side, we've been engaging with the EU quite a lot, especially under the European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus. And this is where we created an opportunity to have joint programs for DFI. So these are guarantee programs. And this is really to scale up investment in the most difficult segments of the market. And a lot, actually, the majority are climate related. So we have developed a program for carbon capture, carbon sink projects, which are still quite far away from private markets, financial markets. And there is another one about the transformation of global value chain, and especially the green transformation of such value chains. Yes.
Sorry, I will ask you to wrap up if possible.
Yes, very good. I just come back on what we believe is the success factors for this blended finance activity. Well, we've seen many initiatives. The ones that are a success have a clear policy objective. So this is clear for the donor, for the DFIs, and for the broader society. What are the policy objectives of these initiatives? Another key important factor is the fact that you can't have finance as the only solution. There needs to be some elements to build a pipeline of projects to get the market creation up and running. And it's not only about providing finance, supplying finance, but also creating the demand for such finance. And that it comes down to a lot of activity in terms of promoting a better enabling environment and a better regulatory environment. And finally, I think the crucial part of the blended finance programs that we saw, which were successful, is the fact that the private parties, whether they are the fund managers who are engaged or the investors, they are listened to, their advice is taken into account. And by the same occasion, they are engaged and they respect the agreement that they have with the donors and the DFIs. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know it's hard to stick to 5 minutes with such a complex and broad topic, but for the sake of dynamism and also for our participants to have the opportunity to hear the question, I will quickly go now to our last speaker for this first round. Alessandro Ascobi, who is head of unit for climate finance at the European Commission, DG Clima. So, Alessandro, my question for you is regarding the recent revision of the EU development finance architecture, where we know international climate finance is essentially located for the EU. We saw a clear priority given to blending instruments. So can you tell us a bit more how this modality of finance compares to other tools the European Union is using in terms of impact, particularly for the most vulnerable? And how does the EU assess the environmental and development impacts of its EU climate blended finance? So that would be my question for you. And if you can try to stick to 5 minutes approximately, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'll do my very best, but I cannot promise. I get very passionate about these topics. And good day, everyone. It's a great pleasure to take part in this webinar. I think so far all the other panelists and speakers have highlighted quite a few interesting and very important issues. So I'll try to add our perspective on indeed a very complex but topical challenges and opportunities around blended finance for climate action. At the outset, I do want to emphasize that for us in the European Union, private finance is not a substitute for public finance. And Rebecca, you mentioned it at the very beginning. It's been demonstrated, of course, through our Council conclusions, but also through the reports that we have provided in terms of EU member states and EIB provisions of international climate finance. I think we have been trying to really walk the talk. And since the launch of the 100 billion goals, we have with the member states and the EIB consistently been the top provider of international climate finance, last year, or rather in 2021, which is still, unfortunately, the latest information we have available. We have provided around 23 billion for international climate finance, over 54% for adaptation. Adaptation remains notably challenging, and close to half of our funding was in the forms of grants. So grants do continue to play an important role when it comes to supporting partner countries in particular, but not only in dealing with the impacts of climate change and preparing, enhancing their resilience. I think next next week, I hope next week we will be able to release the figures for 2022. And I think we will see still this progression in terms of the European Union's contribution. But what is also interesting is that for the very first time, we will be also reporting on the finance that we have been able to mobilize thanks to public support to climate action. And this is, of course, very relevant for the discussions that we're having today, because one of the key questions we have been asking ourselves is how can we actually use our public resources, which are limited, unfortunately, to leverage and mobilize more capital for climate action across the world. And we have looked at existing and new instruments in our portfolio, including, of course, blended finance, more traditional, but also guarantee schemes, as Laure has mentioned before me. And we do think that this is a precondition, because we need all hands on deck. We do need to make all finance flows consistent with the goal of the Paris Agreement if we are to reach the transformation that we need to see in order to be able to meet the temperature goal and try to keep impacts to a manageable level. So we need to shift existing capital. I think the latest IPCC report gives us striking evidence, or stark evidence, of the fact that we still invest quite significantly at the global level into fossil fuels, and that's definitely something that we do not want to see anymore. We need to shift those trillions to the transition, but we also need to leverage additional capital to support such action. And the key instrument that we have at our disposal is, of course, policies, and we need to drive our political vision through our policies and instruments. I think some of the speakers before me have mentioned, for instance, the sustainable finance framework that we have developed in the EU, and that's one of the pieces of the puzzles that we try to use domestically to mobilize a private sector for climate finance and the green transition in particular. I think one of the main instruments or strategies that we have launched in the recent years that is an attempt to help us use to the best of their ability our public resources to leverage private sector is, of course, the Global Gateway strategy. Launched a couple of years back, this is really the EU response to global connectivity challenges with an attempt to build sustainable partnerships and not dependencies through connectivity, but also to use in particular investment in infrastructure to advance the green and digital transitions that we need to see. And the main instrument that we use to implement the Global Gateway is indeed the European Fund for Sustainable Development that Laure has mentioned before me. That is a mix of traditional blended schemes as well as guarantees that are meant to help us bring to scale projects and concepts that have already been tested. This is one of the flagship instruments that we have under the new financial framework for the international dimension. If you wish, it's mirrored in the EU, in the Invest EU fund, but the international level is really looking at combining resources from the Commission's budget, the European Union budget, but also contributions for the member states, and of course working very closely with our financing institutions, both the EIB, but also European development agencies and banks. One of the key features of the EFSD is really an attempt to reduce the risks for private investment. And I think Amar has highlighted how the perception of risk and the real risks are really one of the key barriers to attracting investments, in particular in developing countries and fragile contexts. It is for us an opportunity for engaging with the private sector and really identifying projects and programs that can be scaled out, both that have been successful in Europe and in other countries, and that we can replicate with the necessary, of course, changes and adaptation. I think Global Gateway has the ambition to help us mobilize 300 billion to fill the gap that we see in global infrastructure at the moment. And we have already made quite a lot of progress since we launched the Global Gateway. I think only recently we had the Global Gateway Forum, where we were able to announce remarks, that we have already reached 66 billion in investments. Part of it is through grants, and of course part through blended and guaranteed finance to leverage investments in the private sector. I think Africa was one of the first continent to receive, if you wish, a European investment package under global gateways of approximately 150 billion. And I think this is interesting because it does show that even if the markets, if you wish, in many African countries are still in their infancies and still perceived as very risky, we still can, as public institutions, intervene to attract investments in those countries. We also have significant investments in Asia and the Pacific, and of course Latin America and the Caribbean, where the share of contributions to climate finance between grants and blended finance, if you wish, is certainly different. The EIB for us, of course, plays a very important role because it is the European Bank for Climate Action. I will not expand much on it in the interest of time, but we are working very closely with the EIB and other IFIs and European institutions to make sure that climate safeguards, if you wish, are implemented throughout the choice of investment projects, whether it is environmental impact assessments or carbon footprint assessment at the outset, or whether it is shifting investments more to renewable energy and energy efficiency, for instance, as opposed to interconnections in infrastructure. Maybe one last point, if I may, on the measurement of how do we actually measure effectiveness. I think there's two different aspects to it, perhaps mimicking a bit what Farwa mentioned at the very beginning. On the one hand, we need to look at how effective we have been with our private public finance or in mobilizing financial resources. And I think what, unfortunately, I'm not able to share with you the estimates of finance that we have been able to mobilize through public finance. You will, watch the space. I think we will announce it just before the COP. But what I can say is that we will start to report on how much finance we have been able to mobilize with our grants. And I think this is very important because it enhances transparency, as many of you have already highlighted, but also looks at how we have been additional in terms of mobilizing and bringing in the private sector into investments that wouldn't have happened either in sectors or countries that are estimated to be too risky. The other side is, of course, measuring the effectiveness in terms of how far we have achieved our objectives, whether it is reducing emissions or enhancing resilience. And I think there, we still have a lot of efforts to make, but we have started in the most recent years to develop and use a sort of global framework, if you wish. It's called the Global Europe Results Framework, that is helping us use at each investment and project level the same type of indicators that help us measure impact. Of course, for mitigation, it is easier because we can estimate the amounts of greenhouse gases emissions that we avoid thanks to the intervention of the European Union. We have a longer way to go when it comes to adaptation. That is often very difficult to aggregate at the global level, where you can have very good project indicators, but they are really context specific. And we do hope that the work on the global adaptation goal that is ongoing in the UNFCCC will deliver maybe some results that will help us understand better the effectiveness of our investments and blended finance also in adaptation. I'll stop here in the interest of time, but happy to take questions and come back later. Thank you very much, Rebecca and colleagues.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. What I suggest now, because we heard a lot, something are going in the same direction, some different perspective, point of views. So I'd like maybe our first two speakers, Tim and Farwa, to look at you first before taking some questions from the participants, to have some quick, now I'm gonna be very strict with you all, to have some quick reaction to what you heard from this first round of intervention from our panelists. So maybe Tim, as you were the first, I can look to you first if you have some quick reaction and comments in 1 or 2 minutes, and then I turn to Farwa.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think I will attempt to sum up all of the the incredible amount of sort of knowledge and experience that we have just got here. But I do think one of the key questions that we need to start looking at more is really what are the great I mean, there's a huge amount of different types of investments that are needed into different types of sectors, in different types of contexts, in different types of countries. So when we talk of blended finance, I mean, it really isn't just sort of one broad category that you can say yes or no to. I think I mean, what I would love for us to be able to do is to get a much more nuanced discussion around, you know, sort of what tool for what area, where do we know it definitely will not work? Where is there some evidence that it actually seems to be working quite well? And then look at it as being a broader toolbox. And I'm not sure what the exact way to get there is, but I do think it will require a much broader way of looking, where we have a discussion like we're having now across different types of stakeholders to be aware of at least some of the mistakes that have been made in the past, and where we do see some promising sort of interventions and ideas for what we could be looking at. And of course, I think one of the key areas is just basic things like, are we talking about energy, alternative energy, renewable energy? Are we talking about agriculture? Are we talking about, what type of investment areas would make sense for blended finance, and where do we really just need wealthy countries, governments to live up to the obligations that they already have and actually deliver that type of financing? So I think that's one of my key takeaways.
Thanks. Farwa, what are your key takeaways?
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was an interesting conversation, and we heard many perspectives, maybe ones that we usually don't hear. So that's also very helpful. I think ultimately what we're trying to do with the report is to raise a basic question, as of course Tim mentions, where is blending important and necessary, and where it's not. And I think as we mentioned, there has to be more evidence to back areas in which blending is currently provided. That means having a very clear, harmonized way of measuring impact. B, also harmonizing concepts such as leveraging. I think there's a very interesting question by Pao in the Q&A where he's asking about leveraging, ultimately it comes to how leveraging is defined. So for example, in climate, it's not clear if a high leverage ratio is indicative of new private finance being mobilized, or there was already an existing interest in climate owing to investor demand such as ESG. So there is already an incentive, and we're not sure if leverage ratio is actually the indicator which brings in private investment. So we keep emphasizing this point. And one thing I think we have to also acknowledge is the fact that empirical calculations, impact assessment, there is very little data available. So if you today want to analyze a project, or if you want to assess, let's say, a couple of years of history of an organization, getting access is very problematic. So in fact, in this report, we relied on evidence which was already available, and that was very limited. So there has to be more transparency on that front as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those key takeaways. Now I will pick some question from the participant. You've seen that the Q&A has been quite active. As in interest of time, I won't be able to take all the question I would, because we have a second round of questions, and I would like to hear from you also on a more political perspective. So I have a first question that actually echoes what Farwa just said about the empirical evidence of the leveraging agenda of private capital, and if it's actually working or not. So a report was mentioned in the chat from ODI from 2019, finding that only 0.37 USD dollar were actually mobilized per public dollar invested. So I would like to see if any panelist has a reaction about this number and about the impact actually of this leveraging agenda. I don't know, Laure or Alessandra, if you want to react first, and then of course any other panelists are welcome, and please keep it short if possible.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. However, well, I don't know the report you mentioned, but the leverage ratio we we see on the DFI portfolio is more one-to-one, and when it comes to concessional finance, it's more 1-to-5. So that I don't necessarily recognize the third that you just mentioned. But anyway, I think, and this is related also to I think what Farwa mentioned earlier. The difficulty is to find a balance between leverage and additionality. So, and this is a key question that Farwa put on the table about saying, you know, what exactly, where does blended finance work? And it doesn't work if you are basically going into a territory which is too far from the market, and that starts competing with grants. Because there, obviously, the additionality is there, but the leverage will not be there. And equally, if you deploy blended finance on market segments which are not market failures, the additionality will be very weak. And then you will have a fantastic leverage, but frankly useless, because this leverage would have been there anyway. And the private finance would have flown without even spending this concessional finance on it. So I would take with caution this kind of, you know, just like one number on mobilization. And also relation to that is what you said about the definitions on leverage. So there's a problem of definition with blended finance, as it was raised. It's quite obvious when you deep dive into the topic. There's an equal cacophony on mobilization. So you have the OECD methodology, there's the MDB methodology, the DFIs are broadly following the OECD one. The EU has its own, which is more or less inspired by the OECD. There's quite some work to do there in terms of harmonizing, and that would clear up a lot of the debate on leverage, I think.
Yeah, we heard also that from the beginning recommendation to have a more standardized and a mandatory framework. Maybe Sarah or Amar, I don't know if you want to react to what Laure just shared more from a local or community perspective about this leveraging and the impacts of private sector. Do you have any views on of answer to that question or reaction to what has been said? Alessandra,
yes, sure. So it was great to see what has been shared in terms of the development in blended financing the different organizations are working on. But what is quite clear is that some of these opportunities seem to be targeted majorly towards the larger SMEs, especially for the context of the Global South, and may not necessarily at the moment be accessible by the community-led initiatives, which at the currently a bit of small size tickets. So there's need to also think through on addressing this or targeting this kind of segments of society where the actual action should be involved at the grassroots community levels. If the national determined contributions and addressing the other targets of achieving climate change policies at the international level is to be achieved. So issues of technical assistance, issues of capacity building, issues of support with the business development services, but also in terms of these community-led initiatives or members that are participating in this formulating themselves into either associations or cooperatives for those that are not yet and are still working at ad hoc basis. They may not be able to access this money, yet they are doing a lot of good work at the ground. So as indeed the blended financing need to be scaled at and targeted to different segments really of the society that are addressing climate change impacts. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I will now turn maybe to Amar to answer that question, and then I come back to you, Alessandra. I saw your sign. Maybe Amar, if you want to answer to that question or to react to what have been said, and maybe I can fit in another question from the chat that could be interesting for you. So are there limits to profits company or project can make which receive blended finance, and limits to how much payouts to shareholders or owners in dividends and share buybacks. So are they conditionality actually for actors that are benefiting from blended finance? Thanks.
I love that last question. In the work that we do, it's a very hypothetical question. It's a very hypothetical question. The vast majority of businesses that we work with, we've never faced the dilemma of you're making way too much money. How on earth can we put the brakes on? That's just never happened. It's always been you're losing way too much money. What on earth can we do to tighten up operations, lower costs, make this more efficient, drive more business? Yeah, I would love to have the problem that was posed in that question. I would really love it. I'd love to see so much more of it. And I think it speaks, I mean, the earlier piece speaks a little bit to Tim's question. I think there's, let's be really thoughtful about when we talk about concessional financing and blending. Is it for debt instruments versus for equity instruments? What risks are we really trying to overcome here? Equity fundamentally takes much more risk in these markets, right? I mean, you take board seats, you hold accountability. In the waterfall, when a company goes bankrupt, you're the first ones that get, or you're the last ones that get compensated, put it that way, right? So everybody else that gets paid out before you do as an equity holder. So it's very useful, I think, to be clear what type of financing we're really thinking about here. And I'm a little bit concerned with sort of baby bathwater type kind of problems. I don't know if that has resonance to everyone in different cultures and spaces maybe participating in this forum, but it's this idea that by picking on one and saying there's a problem with this one, we discard everything. And I think it does behoove us all to be really thoughtful about what are we trying to do here? Can we define the impact that we're trying to achieve? Can we hold ourselves accountable to that? I think, Laure, you talked about one of your slides and you had to skip it over, was, can we create hardwired incentives that if you achieve these as a fund manager, if you achieve these impact targets, then you will be compensated. If you don't, you will not be compensated. That makes a lot of sense to me. We do that in our funds. We would encourage to see that right the way across the board. But it's really clear to me to sort of be clear, are we crowding in capital? That should be it's never a yes-no question in our world, but that should be a yes-no question. Are we crowding in capital or not? Did we catalyze additional dollars? Should be a straightforward question. Are we having the impact that we claim that we want to have, whether it's adaptation, resilience, mitigation, whatever, gender, poverty, inclusion, whatever we said, we should be out there measuring it, reporting it back, and being held accountable for it.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to Alessandra, if you have reflection on the first questions and remarks you just heard, and I will also fit in an extra question for you that comes from the chat regarding the quality of finance, and specifically the loans, and therefore the link with the indebtedness that could create perverse incentive that could actually undermine climate action, because countries have to repay their debt in priority, so they cannot invest in climate action, but also exploit more and export more fossil fuels, or be more dependent of industrial agriculture commodities in order to repay their loans. So I'd like to also hear your perspective on the role loans play in climate finance and the link with the debt crisis we see the global south is facing. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks for allowing me to come back in. I wanted to make a couple of comments on the issue of leverage and additionality, and then I'll try to address to the extent possible the very difficult but pertinent question on indebtedness and the debt crisis, or looming debt crisis that we see. So I think on leverage, clearly it depends on sectors and countries, but I think what is also important to remind ourselves that it also depends on external factors. I'll give you an example of the EFSD EDFI plus guarantees. At the very beginning, we had a certain leverage in mind. Now, whether that will be, we will be able to realize that is, our capacity is being severely hampered by the war of aggression against Ukraine that has significantly increased the risks across the globe, whether directly or indirectly, by making supply chains more difficult, by increasing risks of input. And that means that we will not be able, at least in the short and immediate term, to leverage as much as we had thought we would be able to. And I think this also needs to be kept into account. Sometimes there are unforeseen events that affect us. Maybe it may be interesting for colleagues to look at the latest OECD report that you have mentioned in the framing, Rebecca, where there is a discussion around finance that has been mobilized and therefore the leverage of private finance. But of course, this is only in transfers from north to south, so to speak, and only in the sphere of climate action and not in the broader discussions around SDGs. I think the issue of additionality is critical, and I confess it is something that we are struggling with in the EU. Sometimes there are some investments where we are unclear whether they are really truly additional, or where they have a risk of crowding out private banks or private investors. But I do think that we are improving in that respect, and that takes all the three main stakeholders to engage together, us, of course, but also the banks, the IFIs, as well as the recipient countries in particular. I think it is interesting to see that the latest report that the Climate Policy Initiative released on financial flows for climate. You will see that at least as much climate finance globally is actually private sector investment, and this is not leverage, it's not mobilized, it's actual private capital that goes into climate action. And so there is a clear need for us to make sure that our instruments do not reduce the opportunities for the private sector to mobilize their own capital for climate action by introducing, distortions through blending or de-risking investments. How do we get there? We need domestic policies. It needs to be policy driven. We need, of course, governments to have the capacity to set in place the right environment, but we also need banks, including central banks, as well as businesses, to know what the opportunities are and what they can do with the instruments we have, moving outside, if you wish, the comfort zone. We need to make sure we have the right incentives and disincentives in place, as Amar and Laure and several before me have mentioned. We need clear targets, and we need long-term targets, and we need to give certainty to private investors that the trajectory is there to stay. And I think this is something that we in Europe hear very much from our businesses. It's great that we will have 2040 targets because these give us the direction. And of course, you need also taxonomies, disclosure measures to increase transparencies. You need standards to make sure that we are all aligned on the same page. And finally, last but not least, we need a pipeline of projects that is innovative and transformative. And this is really something where sometimes we are struggling and where we end up with the low-hanging fruit, if you wish, and we do more of the same rather than looking at what could be a bit more difficult, but perhaps more interesting to scale out. One last word, and Rebecca, forgive me for being a bit too long on the loans and indebtedness. I think this is extremely pertinent. We've seen it on the top of the agenda, starting from the Paris Global Finance Impact Summit in July this year, and I think it's been repeated also by the African leaders at the Africa Climate Summit. From our perspective, this is certainly an element of consideration in all our discussions with the private sector, with banks, but also in particular with countries if they are to take sovereign loans, to make sure that there is sustainability in the debt ratio of a country. It's not always an easy discussion, and we are not the only partners, of course. There are many international institutions that play a key role, not least, of course, the IMF, but it is something that is certainly at the top of our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I realize time has flight. Obviously, very passionate discussion, also very important, I think, to give the time to everyone to share their views. So we had a second round planned, but as you see, we just have 13 minutes left. So we'll try to do a mix of closing remarks and the last round of questions we had planned. So I'll go in the same order, but I really will ask you to stick to 2 minutes now, answering a simple question I will ask you, probably repeating some stuff you say, but just to keep a last concluding remarks and messages that you want to share about this a very important topic. So Sarah, I will start with you. So trying to summarize and based also on what you've been hearing. So what can we do to ensure that blended finance project benefit communities that need it the most rather than large investors and companies? So what are your main messages that you want to share with the audience today? Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca, for that question. My closing remarks is to say that communities are doing quite a lot, especially the women and young people, and they do need support, which at times is not encompassed from the current instruments that some of the blended financing is providing. So even as those instruments and funds are being designed, there's need to also put into consideration, especially from the Global South, the kind of initiatives in terms of the scale. For instance, if some of the funds are requiring a minimum take of about $100,000 US, some of these community-led initiatives are not yet in position to be able to absorb this kind of financing and be able to pay it back. And then issues of grants are still very key to address a number of gaps that are still in place, issues of market development support that is needed, issues to do with management of the businesses, governance issues. So if this support is provided to such community-based initiatives, then they would be able, one, to scale up, reach out to more communities, because these are grassroots solutions where they are most needed by the communities to be able to adopt either to the challenges in energy, specifically for cooking. As you saw, there's a lot of cooking energy solutions, because the use of firewood that is leading to environmental degradation and definitely emissions. As you see that majority of these countries, the emissions are coming from the follow sector that are contributing to the greenhouse gases. So this is really a pertinent area. So also the enabling environment, indeed, issues of incentives, whether in taxes, that would enable communities to be able to adopt the technologies that these alternatives or community-based alternatives are trying to promote. That would be very key in being able to address the challenges at the community level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really clear and succinct. Thanks for these last messages. Amar, over to you. So maybe also a very overarching question and to enable you to give your closing remarks. So how can blending stakeholders ensure that blending supports local companies, entrepreneurs, and communities?
Yeah, look, it's a great question and a great discussion all around. I think a couple of things come to mind based on this conversation overall. Just maybe 2 points, right? One, there's so much here. How do we keep it simple? We've alluded a couple of times to being fast, being nimble, experimenting, and being held accountable to those experiments. But how do we keep it simple so that we can really get these instruments to proliferate on the ground and we can get the feedback from them? And that seems to me to really hinge on this idea of where is the accountability, what are the metrics that we're trying to achieve, and how do we hold ourselves accountable to those metrics? So keep it simple, be clear about the KPIs. You know, so much of the adaptation debate is really around how the communities, right, people in underserved markets, how do they perceive these products? And we don't do enough to hear back on the value added from these products, from these people. What we can do is understand that they can choose whether or not to buy these products. So certain companies will fail by putting the wrong technology or too expensive technology or low value technology into play. And that is a test in itself. But we can do so much more to ensure that we're really hitting value-adding goals in terms of whether this helps the community to become more adaptive, our income's going up, our income stabilizing, is there an inclusive element of this, is there gender diversity? Yeah, how is this happening, and what is the customer base? And we can ask those questions as investors of the companies that we invest in, and hold ourselves accountable to that. So that would be my first kind of big picture point. Keep it simple, hold yourself accountable, and then run the metrics, right? Say what you're going to do and then run the metrics. This shouldn't be something that becomes a very philosophical debate. The second kind of last kind of closing point, at the Africa Climate Summit, someone just mentioned it. You know, we had this conversation about the potential of the continent versus the constraints. And the potential of the continent is just extraordinary, right? I mean, a fast-growing continent with really talented people, increasingly urbanizing, increasingly educated, increasingly competitive, yet a real absence and a capital starvation. And I'm almost done. 81% of green projects in the developed world gets financed by the private sector. Only 14% gets financed in emerging and frontier markets. We have to change that. And if blending can do that in a pragmatic way, I'd love to see more of that happen. And I can just speak from where we sit as an intermediary in this space between the communities, the companies, and foreign investors. You know, we kind of don't want an either or, who benefits type question, Rebecca, in the way that you framed it. What we want is a both and, right? We know that the balance should be in the developing South and with communities and with small businesses in those markets. Of course, we want to see more there, but it has to be both and. Otherwise, we don't create the virtuous circle that we need to try to create here. But thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much, and thanks also for being succinct and very clear as well. Laure, coming back to you with a same overarching question, and it's also actually linking to what Amar was sharing. How can DFIs ensure to fight effectively against maybe some critiques that we heard against the lack of transparency and accountability, because we know that accountability is key in this debate, and I'd like for you maybe to summarize your perspective and the way forward and keys of success in that regard. Thanks.
Of course, thanks. Well, on transparency, that's actually a process. I don't know if you noticed a couple of days ago, BII announced they have as an objective now to be one of the most transparent DFIs. So there's I would say what we observe in our association is that the transparency, the disclosure, it's all a matter for the shareholders of the DFIs to agree on. Also the donors when it comes to blended finance. So the DFIs are effectively a conduit of that. And I think with what we just talked about, and more generally the fact that the debate on blended finance will be only increasing and continuing, there will be more and more transparency measures that the DFIs will have to respond to. So that's where, and we are coming from a world where, frankly, most of our stakeholders didn't even know what a DFI was 10 years ago. So asking DFIs to be transparent is relatively a new question compared to the timeline of what we are talking about here. But then the other issue is, I think, with transparency, and it's, I mean, when we talk of transparency, it's disclosure, monitoring, reporting. All this has a cost, so that needs to be factored in, and that's not that's actually a broader debate. If you look at the way the banking community react to the sustainable finance framework in the EU, how much this is going to cost. Personally, I see totally the business model for consultants who will do ESG reporting of audit firms. That is a huge opportunity for them. Now, when you're the entity that has to disclose, there is really a question of how much money and basically how much of your bottom line you put into this. And that is again related to the question. The way it's more closely related, I think, to the discussion today is the fact that we really lack speed so far on this blended finance initiative. I mentioned in my introduction that some initiatives, launched in 2017, 2018. When you look at the numbers, still in 2020, they are stalled. They are picking up slowly. My personal view on this is that it is not acceptable, and we should really more, rather than thinking, oh, we need this and we need that and we need to demonstrate this, we really need to create an environment where we can do these schemes effectively and quickly. Because it's not, if it takes 15 years to deploy, I would even myself doubt that this is even necessary to do blended finance.
Thank you very much. Lastly, I will turn to Alessandra with maybe a more, overall question on the current politics and maybe also looking towards the upcoming COP. So looking at COP28, at the finance negotiation coming up, at the future NCQG that needs to be built, what do you think is the EU capacity to rebuild trust, if we can all agree that we are in a mistrust environment? So within the climate finance negotiation, but maybe overall climate negotiation, and ensuring that the blending agenda does not undermine public finance needs. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And indeed, I couldn't agree more with you. What we do need at COP28 on climate finance in particular is to rebuild the trust. I mean, I don't think we can escape from the fact that the international community has failed to deliver on the commitment of 100 billion goal to date. This is a fact. I do think that we in the EU have been, good students. We have delivered our climate finance, and we keep doing and increasing our contributions internationally. We don't stop. We don't rest on our achievements. We will. Unfortunately, I was hoping I'd be able to share with you the latest information today, but you will have to wait another week to see the latest figures. But the trend is a positive trend for the European Union. And I do think, Rebecca, you mentioned at the beginning the OECD report. I know there are many parties who don't trust necessarily the findings of the OECD report, but I do think that the trend that is highlighted there is very positive, with an 8% increase on a year-to-year contribution at the global level of climate finance from developed countries towards developing countries. I think we are on track to reach the goal to have this year, but of course this is not enough. Climate finance will be pervasive, if I so may say, in the agenda of the COP28. We do need to demonstrate our ability to deliver on the commitments. I think that the provisional agreement of the Transitional Committee on the Loss and Damage Funding Arrangement and Fund is already sending very positive signals, and as EU we stand ready to engage constructively in that discussion and contribute to the arrangements and the fund if and when it will be set up. I think what I take away also from this discussion, and what I want to emphasize perhaps in closing, is that there is, we talk a lot about private finance and mobilizing investments from the private sector, but this is by no means a way for us to escape from our responsibility. It's just a recognition that the scale of the challenge is such that we need all hands on deck, as I mentioned before. It is quite clear that private finance is not, or blended finance for that matter, is not a silver bullet. It is an important instrument that we have, one that we will need to continue showcasing and using also in the context of the negotiations. But we need to use it where it brings most values. And I think grants and direct payments will continue to play an extremely important role, in particular for local communities, for fragile states, and for adaptation. But even for that, we can learn a lot from what has already been done. So for us, let me come back to the GST, and I'll wrap up, I promise, Rebecca. To the COP28. I think our ultimate objective should be, in our view, at the collective level, to align or make sure that all finance flows are consistent with the goal of the Paris Agreement. That's really the only way forward that we have, and we're hoping that the global stocktake will also be able to give parties some indications on how that can be achieved and how it could feed into the process of setting the new collective quantified goal that you have mentioned, without clearly wanting to escape the responsibility of the European Union as a donor country, as a development partner towards our international partners. Thanks.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'm looking forward to those discussions in Dubai next week. Team Farwa, as a main organizer of this webinar, ActionAid and Eurodat, I don't know if you have some quick closing remarks that you want to share with the audience and the panelists before we close our webinar. We're already 2 minutes ahead of time, so do you want to quickly come in?
I don't know if you want to say anything, Farwa. I guess from my side, I just really would like to thank everyone for, I mean, I think a great and rich discussion. I wish we had more time for the discussion here at the end and to answer
a whole day.
questions. But I think I just think it's a really important discussion to be having across different stakeholders, to be honest. I mean, we are used to having these discussions in NGO circles, and we know what we think about these things on a sort of a large macro scale. But for me, anyway, I think it's been really exciting and interesting to get some perspectives, from different stakeholders. And I think we can have a more nuanced discussion this way. And I guess the key point I think that I'm taking with me is that it's not a silver bullet, and that we can't use it as an excuse to not live up to our obligations. But on the other hand, also that it's really important to listen to some of the people on the ground, that there are people out there who are trying to start small businesses, that are trying to solve local problems, who are already borrowing money from various sources at exorbitant rates. So what is our answer in those cases to those communities and those people and those entrepreneurs? Can we be useful? I think that's an important discussion also. So anyway, thank you so much to everyone who participated, and I look forward to continuing the discussions.
Thank you, team. Farwa?
Yeah, I don't think I'll have a concluding statement. I just want to thank everyone for being here, and we hope to share the report with you as soon as it's out. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks. And that being said, I will also thank the panelists for their very passionate and comprehensive remarks and interaction. Also the participants for all the questions. As I said, this webinar has been recorded, so you can use it for further purposes. The report will be out soon, and we will keep on engaging on those on this very important topic. Looking also forward to engage on all the climate finance issue at COP and beyond. So thank you all, and I'm wishing you a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thanks to you as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks.